least the expo's open now. There's actually people milling around. Provides, it's a good setting.
Just don't stare into the lights.
Don't stare into the lights?
Yeah.
Oh, that was my first mistake. Oh. Now I see a squares. Getting new hardware is kind of like getting a puppy. It's exciting and fun for the first few hours, and then you have to start taking care of it. There's the daily walks, constant feeding, annual checkups, and more, and suddenly that puppy that seems so exciting is now just another thing that you need to take care of. But there are rewards of dog ownership that cannot be overstated, having a stalwart companion through your side through thick and thin, and also knowing when the UPS truck has arrived on your block. Hello everyone, welcome to the AnexiPod, the official podcast for Anexinet. This is episode 22, recorded September 26th, 2017 at the Podcast Center at Microsoft Ignite in front of a live studio audience. Feel free to make a little noise. Let me know you're out there. Thank you. Here on the AnexiPod, we talk technology for the enterprise, covering infrastructure, app dev, analytics, and anything else that is shiny. On this episode, we're going to be talking about Azure Stack operations and what you need to know day one and beyond. Joining me from the Azure Stack product team is Daniel Savage.
Hello.
And Spencer Shepler. Welcome to the show, gentlemen.
Yep, thanks.
Thank you. Before we get started, can you tell the audience a little bit about yourself and what you do on the Azure Stack team?
So yes, I'm Spencer Shepler, and I'm a program manager and architect in the Azure Stack team, focused on kind of our hardware architecture, working with our partners to bring that to market, and kind of looking forward as we figure out what's next for the product.
Okay, great. And Daniel?
Yep. Hi, my name's Daniel Savage. I'm also a PM on the Azure Stack engineering team. Me and my team own actually the operator scenarios for Azure Stack. So everything from monitoring to security. We own the administration user experience, how Azure Stack gets updated, and various things like that.
Okay, great. So all this week, I know there's going to be a ton of hype about Azure Stack and a whole bunch of sessions about all the awesome sauce that lies underneath Azure Stack. And when Azure Stack eventually hits your data center floor, the admin folks out there are going to feel like they got the proverbial puppy. It's very exciting, new hardware, right? But even though Azure Stack is a fully packaged and managed solution, as everyone knows, there is some care and feeding involved since it lives in your data center. And that's the central topic for this discussion. So let's start with first principles. Let's say I'm beginning my Azure Stack journey. What do I need to know about sizing Azure Stack, and what's the process and parameters I was used to determine what I need?
So there's actually, I'll take that one. So it's
okay.
Kind of an interesting scenario, because it's a real change in how people think about how to build out a system. It's quite a bit different from kind of a traditional virtualization stack, where maybe in the past you'd look at the number of VMs and kind of overall capacity and have a lot of flexibility in the way you'd construct a system. But with Azure and Azure Stack, with their predefined VM sizes and how the system's put together, you really have to think ahead of the game and kind of get that sized out right when you first start. So you look at your application workloads, define the VMs, look at the Azure VM sizes, and that'll really drive then the rest of the discussion with the hardware partners about how they size and build that out and what they can provide. So.
Okay, are there some tool sets that are already available to sort of measure that stuff out, or some suggestions that you've come up with?
Actually, the best tool set is that it's actually Azure. So starting there and building out applications and getting understanding about how that's going to look for the system and what how it's going to actually work and perform. It's actually the best tool that we have available. So it's a great way to kind of move forward, and you can use that knowledge and then apply that to kind of how you want to build out the Azure Stack system itself.
Okay, so if you're already using Azure, which hopefully you are, you could deploy those workloads in Azure to just test them out, get a measure of how much capacity you need, and then apply that back to your Azure Stack deployment.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Yeah, and to add to that, I would say that the starting point of the journey is, as Spencer alluded to, the applications. And having that conversation with your application developers and knowing how to match the use cases of how they're building applications, because that's really the starting point to be able to then go to Azure or to the sizing and say, I'm building this type of application that meets this use case, so therefore I need to provision these set of resources, which will then in turn tell you what size of kind of Azure Stack system you need to be. We've talked a lot about If people have been to some of our initial keynotes around Azure Stack, the 3 use cases which Azure Stack's initially designed for, which is building modern applications, edge and disconnected scenarios, or applications that need to make specific regulatory requirements. So people should use that as a starting point in their journey, and that'll help them get started.
Okay, so we've gone down the journey, we've sized out our Azure Stack solution, and now I'm ready to order. What is the process that I have to go through to prepare my site to receive Azure Stack and get my personnel ready to actually start running it?
Yeah, it's going to be kind of the classic deployment. I mean, you're going to have rack of equipment depending on kind of the size that you end up choosing.
Right.
But it is an integrated system, so it'll essentially come in that set, and the OEM partners will work through the services deliver. But it's a classic things like power, heating, cooling, right, and trying to deal with network connectivity. One of the things that we've kind of bumped up against is that Azure Stack is an integration for the layer 3 on the network, so it's really kind of thinking about a little bit up-leveling the discussion and looking at the kind of border network configurations and integrating at that point. And that's really probably the biggest piece. And then the second big choice is really, if you're going to run connected or disconnected from an identity standpoint, looking at Azure Active Directory or ADFS for integration. So that's the other kind of major point in the integration steps.
Right, so if you choose to go with ADFS, you obviously need an ADFS environment to snap that into.
That's right.
So you'd have to set those servers up if you don't already have them.
That's right.
Is actually not very hard anymore.
No, yeah, it's pretty straightforward.
You mentioned network connectivity, and I know that's something that's come up several times. Azure has the concept of public IP addresses and then all the VNets that are encapsulated. So how do I integrate my larger network with the Azure Stack network?
Right, so the main components that we ask for, essentially there are certainly internal IP address ranges that we use for Azure Stack. So all the infrastructure and storage has a way to communicate, and we segment that off from any of the public traffic that occurs within Azure Stack. So the site surveys ask for kind of the classic subnet ranges. We look for kind of out-of-band management subnet, infrastructure subnet that includes storage and some of the internal private IPs. Okay. And then there'll be a range, as you say, for external public IP addresses. And we share some of those. Azure Stack does have endpoints that are addressable externally. So like the portal, some of the over-the-world services like storage will be addressable. And then the rest of that content will then kind of integrate for the tenant workloads.
Okay.
And so the other big integration point from a networking standpoint is setting up a firewall that'll sit in front of Azure Stack. So we have certainly ACLs in the physical switches and a lot of other security content in the system, but there's still a need to kind of firewall the overall solution, right, and have control, say in a DMZ if you're going to access it over the public internet, or even in a corporate environment, you may still choose to firewall the system. So.
Yeah, I imagine for like MSPs, they're going to want to give public IP addresses to the tenants.
That's right.
So that could be sort of that DMZ where they're natting it out in some way.
Exactly.
Okay,
right.
That makes sense. And the admin and portal endpoints, they use HTTPS, so they're using certificates. Where are those certificates coming from? Because I know on the development kit, it just creates its own certificate authority.
Right.
Which is fine because it's a development kit, right? You're not too worried about the trust chain. Where do those certificates come from in a real deployment?
Yeah, so they're actually still, even in a classic production environment, there is a certificate authority that's internal to Azure Stack. So we use obviously an instance that treats all the internal services, so we can rotate those on a regular basis and deal with them. But any public endpoint is going to need an external real certificate, right? We're not going to create a root chain that's just for Azure Stack. So the customer is going to provide those as part of the integration and data center integration pieces that they have. So there's a set that we define, we know what those are, we can communicate those during kind of initial pre-sales or at the point they're doing data center integration. And the other 2 points that you kind of think about integration, we talked a little bit about identity, but there'll also be things for, we need a time server, obviously external of Azure Stack.
Okay.
And then also a DNS reference. So we have, we need to do name resolution, and so that's kind of the other minor detail that pops up.
DNS seems like moderately important, like a thing you might need, yeah. So we talked about the physical data center and the network, but I also have a bunch of admin and operation folks that need to manage this. Is there going to be Microsoft certification track or training to help them understand how to manage Azure Stack?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we've coined the term in the new role, the Azure Stack operator.
Okay.
And I'll just give 2 quick plugs for the people here and for people listening offline to get sessions. On the integration, there's a session by Thomas Rodinger on Wednesday everything that Spencer kind of summarized as a whole session here at Ignite for integrating Azure Stack into your data center.
Okay.
And I have a session later on today on operating Azure Stack at 4 o'clock. But yes, on the certification, we are working on a role. Actually, if you go to azure.com and look up the Azure roles, you'll see an Azure Stack operator there, and the initial set of training is starting to show up there. We will have more training and specific courses coming out through the rest of this year, with a certification actually targeted for the January and calendar year 18. So,
okay,
yep.
Great. So people can pursue that if
Yep.
they know Azure Stack is coming their way.
Yep.
So I've got my solution racked, stacked, connected to network. My my operations people are all trained up and ready to go. And now I'm ready to start provisioning resources, right? Or are there some additional steps I need to take to, as the admin, to get it ready for internal consumption?
Yeah, I think that comes back into the application planning and who you're serving with Azure Stack. Right?
Okay.
So you're going to build out Azure Stack. You're doing it for a purpose, right? So in the context of having that conversation with your application developers, they're going to give you a set of needs and requirements, and then your job as the Azure Stack operator is to provision the space so they can actually configure those resources. So we have the concept called plans and offers in Azure Stack, and that'll really be one of the first steps that you're going to be doing, is saying, okay, I have a set of developers who need access to a subscription that allows them to provision X many VMs or consume X amount of storage. So that's going to be your starting point, is in the context of that application conversation, working out how you carve out space on Azure Stack for them to be able to do that.
Okay.
Okay.
And oh, go ahead.
Sorry. And then the second part is, if you use Azure and you're familiar with Azure, you go create a virtual machine. The first thing you see when you create that virtual machine is you get a choice. Azure provisions a marketplace, so you can actually choose from there to deploy virtual machines or various solutions. As the Azure Stack operator, obviously, you're responsible for curating that marketplace.
Mm-hmm.
So once you're familiar with your developer requirements, you then have to curate that marketplace, which you can pull down from Azure. You can select the items you want to make available to your subscriptions and to your developers. So I would say they're the two main starting points you need to get familiar with.
Okay, and now that I've opened it up to that team of developers, my concern is they're going to eat as much resources as I give to them. I don't want them to overrun my entire system.
Yep.
So is there a way to limit that development team from gobbling up the entire stack?
Yeah, absolutely. In the context of creating plans and offers, what you also create is quotas within there. So a plan and an offer contains a quota which says, for this particular plan, and you see these in Azure, like, okay, you have a standard plan, I have an MSDN subscription, those type of things. They're all bound plans. So you as the Azure Stack operator, you go in and you create the plan and say, when someone creates a subscription from this plan, they're only allowed to consume X amount of resources. So you can control that.
Okay, that seems useful.
Yes.
Because I know developers, they're kind of like goldfish. They'll grow to whatever bowl you put them in, right?
Yep.
So day 2 has arrived. I've got my developers using the solution, and I need to start doing software maintenance. I have to patch hosts, I imagine. You know, there's going to be service packs that come out for Azure Stack. Do I need to take the tenant workloads offline to do that patching, or is there going to be some process that keeps everything up while it rolls through?
The intent is that we actually keep everything up and running. Like you said, there's Azure Stack will have software updates. The intent is that we're doing that on a monthly basis, so that we can keep everything up to date from a patch, from a security standpoint. There'll be bug fixes and new features in Azure Stack as it moves forward, and so we're really, in that cloud model, we're always moving forward, right? So we're trying to make sure that we're keeping as consistent as possible with Azure and also up to date as possible. And with the way that we have everything structured in Azure Stack is that we do work to keep everything up and running. So we actually will live migrate workloads between the physical hosts as we just update those.
Okay.
And then we'll update the infrastructure itself in a way that we work to keep everything up and running. But there will be occasional glitches, right? I mean, there's if you have a site-to-site gateway, there may be a short drop in the VPN connection, things like that may occur. So it's best really to kind of set aside and have kind of a maintenance window so that you give people a heads up, and it's like you're really going to be running through those steps. So
yeah, and I think the 2 points. I think the important is that that conversation with your application developers, like when you're building on Azure, your developers need to build resilient applications. You really build in the resiliency in at the application layer.
Right.
So like you build an application in Azure, you're going to plan that Azure may have glitches. I mean, yes, they have an SLA around those things, but you really want the application developer to have his application be resilient to those things. So in the context of Azure Stack, those same development rules apply, and they should take that into account.
Right.
But obviously, as IT admins, I mean, you're going to be patching things. You want to keep it up and running, as Spencer said, like planning for maintenance and ensuring you got that in. I'll just touch a little bit more on the orchestration process, because it's important to note that because Azure Stack is an integrated system, you're not doing the patching individually of components. We have an orchestration system in there that takes care of patching everything, because it's not just the host, it's the software that we have within the stack that actually runs Azure Stack, a set of VMs and software capabilities. So I have an orchestration engine, and we actually deliver a single package to you from a software perspective, and you just consume that through the administrator user experience. It's a upload the package, click update now, and it orchestrates all of that, taking that into account. So that's a little bit more on that.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I know from a Azure Public Cloud perspective, there is no live migration. If that host needs to come down for maintenance, your VMs are going down with it, and they'll pop back up on another host, but there's none of that like smooth migration process like you would have on Azure Stack. So hopefully your developers already know that, because they're developing stuff in Azure, and so they're accustomed to the fact that a particular VM can go down, and hopefully the application stays up, right?
That's always going to be the case, because I mean, we're going to not be able to prevent against hardware failures, right? So they really have to deal with, things will go wrong, they have to get it fixed, but building resilient applications, we have resilient infrastructure, so we can keep things up and running around, say, storage failures, et cetera, that we can deal with the occasional hard disk drive that fails, or something like that. And so it's really being considerate and trying to think, how to apply that Azure model to an Azure Stack system as well.
So resiliency layer cake, we could call it.
Yeah, exactly.
Now I kind of want cake. So the best ops people will say that they're doing a good job if no one even knows they're there. Right. And that means they have to be proactive about preventing issues before they happen, and spotting trends before they become problems. So let's apply that to Azure Stack. How do I go about monitoring the solution?
Yeah, good question. So Azure Stack has an integrated monitoring system within it that is watching the health of the various aspects of the system. We spend a lot of time kind of working with the teams who build the software components that run Azure Stack to make sure that when things go wrong and alerts are generated, we're not just creating noise for admins to sift through. Every alert we create should have a set of remediation steps that people can walk through. I talk with my team, and we're working on the monitoring. Our job is to really try and kind of make that go away, right? We're trying to make the system run as healthy as we can and put our effort into there. We don't just want to create a kind of set of signals for people to go and try and figure out what's going wrong. It's an integrated system. It's appliance. We know how that thing's worked. We know how it's deployed. It's configured. We should be when we generate alerts, we should know that something's wrong and be able to give the actionable steps to be able to do that. So, yeah.
That seems very helpful. And will it take any sort of auto remediation steps? Is that kind of going to be baked into the automation layer?
There'll be some of that. And so if you look at if we start the infrastructure pieces, we'll kind of work our way up. So classic storage failures, we actually leave some capacity in the underlying storage stack, so that if we do have a drive fail, that we can actually start a rebuild of that data, so we can come back to healthy without having one drive fail in the system, and having to kind of immediately deal with that. So you can have, that'll rebuild, you can get the disk drive replaced when it comes in, or if you've got spares, you can put that in place. If a host fails for some reason, or goes offline because of a network failure, VMs that were on that host will get restarted elsewhere within the system. So we leave enough capacity. We talked a little bit about kind of the patch and update cycle. We do have capacity. We can move things around and adapt, and we can use that also in kind of a failure scenario. So if a host goes down, we work to restart those workloads elsewhere in the system. So those are the quick two things that'll kind of get remediated just automatically.
Okay. So are there any plans to integrate with third-party solutions or other Microsoft solutions to kind of push the monitoring out to a centralized source?
Yeah, absolutely. So we know that Azure Stack is going to land in your data center as part of your real estate, and we recognize that most people have monitoring systems that are doing various things within their data center.
Right.
So Azure Stack, we First of all, Azure Stack, everything that is available on the admin surface, so like looking at alerts or performing patch and update, is available through a REST API, meaning it can be integrated into process flow that we have. What we have produced is a management pack for a System Center Operations Manager. So for people who have System Center in their estate, they can get up and running and point that at Azure Stack for third-party monitoring, which obviously Operations Manager is connected to various upstream systems like ticketing and things like that, so you get that workflow there. But obviously recognizing System Center is not the only product out there. We actually have integrations for Nagios as well. And I think that's available as open source libraries, so people can take that and use that if they have other systems there. So yeah, absolutely, we recognize that Azure Stack needs to be integrated, and we provided those integrations.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, Nagios is the one that I hear most often.
Okay,
so I'm
good.
glad to hear
that. That one then.
It's right there. Okay, awesome. Now, if something does go wrong and ops folks need to recover, let's talk about like disaster recovery. Is it possible to back up the Azure Stack config itself?
Yes. So, so the way to think about backup and disaster recovery is to think about two kind of layers in that. And again, I'll go to the application layer. The application layer, like in Azure, the application and the people running those applications need to think about the backup and DR of that. Okay. So we will support various kind of partners in that space. So for backing up VMs to kind of off the stamp, or using products like Azure Backup and Azure Site Recovery in the tenant space, we will kind of support that. But that's like the application layer, right? Then for the infrastructure side, our initial starting point is to support the ability to restore Azure Stack when we get a catastrophic failure. So we have a backup configuration within Azure Stack in the administrative experience where we back up that metadata and config out to an external share, which you as admins can then kind of look after and keep those backups there. And that's really for when, we lose the cloud, something catastrophic, you're going to get your OEM partner in to kind of help you get it up and redeploy, and then you bring back in that config, and then you bring your workloads back onto it. But again, that separation is kind of critically important.
Okay. And you mentioned the tenant workloads, the using Azure Backup or Azure Site Recovery. Is there an integration point to Azure Public Cloud where I could send my VM backups to Azure Public Cloud, or use Azure Site Recovery to replicate them up?
Yes, that's the plan, is that will support that the tenants can back up into Azure and then use ASR into Azure. So yeah.
And if I'm very lucky and I have two Azure stacks in two different regions, is the plan to support site recovery cross-region as well?
So that is something we've heard feedback on, and we'll kind of look to think about how we expand those scenarios kind of going forward. I'll plug again. Hector Linares has a session on BCDR, I think on Wednesday or Thursday. Go see that session or look it up from the kind of podcast notes. He'll spend an hour, 75 minutes talking about all the BCDR options. And he's a person for kind of taking that feedback on what things we do in the future. And we will be driven by that feedback on what people's requirements are around those things. So.
I feel like we're just scratching the surface
Absolutely.
on that.
Yeah.
Okay. So I mentioned another region. So there's obviously a scalability component to Azure Stack. And once tenants get a taste of how awesome Azure Stack is, they're probably going to want to add capacity. So I know that the base unit is a scale unit, right? That's up to 12 nodes today, and
yes, that's right.
16 nodes sometime in the near future.
Right. Yes, we actually have a plan to kind of move forward scalability wise, and so I think there's three main vectors, right, that we think about in scalability. The first is kind of the size of that scale unit, the number of servers in that system, and you're right. So we start from 4 to 12, kind of single node increments possibly.
Right.
And then we'll look to scale kind of probably up to 16 as we move forward, and that's going to be the first part of next year that we'll look at that. And then after that, we really look at additional scale units and additional regions for Azure Stack as we scale.
So within the scale unit, do all of the nodes have to be the same exact hardware?
Yes, they do. Yeah. So we're based on Windows Server 2016, and we use Spaces Direct, and the way we place VMs in the system. All of that essentially says those servers have to be exactly the same. So the same processor architectures, same configuration, amount of memory, storage configuration. That way, it gives us the hyperconverged network and system that we need.
Okay.
And it actually simplifies a lot of things like if I have to replace a server, if I have to replace storage devices when they fail, when I think about scaling a system vertically, as we just talked about, increasing the number of servers in a system, makes those scenarios very much more tenable, right? I can actually do that both from a purchasing standpoint, vendors can support it much more easily, and then our software can accommodate that much more easily as well. And it also simplifies kind of that initial question you had about capacity planning. I can rationalize like, oh, I'm going to add a number of servers. I know exactly how much storage is going to come into the system. I know what the VM capacities are going to be for that and how the system is going to work in general.
And imagine there's some overhead that Azure Stack takes out of each of those components.
Yeah, exactly right. We're kind of it's a unique approach, I think, in that we're running, effectively, all of Azure, right? We're being consistent with Azure, and we're doing that within the system that we're deploying on for the customer. So we don't have a separate management cluster, so to speak. It's really contained within the system. So that infrastructure that we're providing, we do run all of that in a central set of virtual machines, and so it allows us the ability to create resilient services even within Azure Stack. As we talked about it a little bit earlier, it's the applications have to think about what's their resiliency model going to be, and how's that going to apply to an Azure Stack system. And Azure, as they begin to kind of work through that roadmap, and we've done the same thing in the infrastructure itself. So we've worked to make sure that we have multiple VMs that cover a particular service, that they're placed on separate servers, so when and if we have failures, right, that those can be resilient. And so we do consume, if you look at kind of the smallest configuration, so we start out at 256 gig of memory minimum for those servers. If you kind of take that as a context, we consume about one server's worth of capacity for the infrastructure.
Okay.
And in a single scale unit, we don't really scale the infrastructure too much. There's a couple points that we do, but it's not significant. So you can think that if you go to, say, a 12 server system, it's still going to be about one server's worth of capacity. So it's really a flat consumption. We don't consume, linearly as we add servers to the systems.
Right, because a lot of the components that are driving the infrastructure are all part of Windows Server, so that the virtualization host that sits underneath is providing those services.
That's right. Yeah. So the base infrastructure for storage is all built into Windows Server. It's the same thing that you're going to use in a software-defined system out of Windows Server, just for Spaces Direct, for example, if you're going to do that. So it's the same infrastructure, and we're piggybacking on all that experience and deployment that's in the field already. So it's really a great base for us to build from, and I think that we've done, it's an interesting job to put it together. So.
Right. So I was going to ask you about adding more storage to an existing scale unit, but it sounds like you've already defined what each node is going to look like, so you can't go storage heavy on a particular node if you're running low, right?
Yeah, that's right. So this one of the things initially with the way Spaces Direct works, you're right. So when you think about storage, it's really going to be a kind of a linear expansion as you add servers. So again, kind of come back to that sizing discussion you have initially. You really have to take a look at those applications and understand what their storage requirements are and how they're going to grow over time and what you're going to need for data retention, and then get the sizing as close as you can up front with the system. So that really means choosing disk drive capacities and server configurations that kind of match that storage configuration. This is a discussion that we work to build out kind of those scenarios with our hardware partners. And so they've been seeded with that information. They're building experience themselves. They've obviously been in the business of selling storage for a long time.
Right.
So they can work with their customers and do POCs and understand what the performance is going to be and kind of work to get that in place. Now that's kind of the base system, and we I think we provide actually quite a bit of capacity, I think, for the size of systems we have. But there will be cases where customers need to add additional storage. We'll have things in their estate, right, that they need to continue to use. And so if somebody needs that additional capacity, then adding a NAS device, either through NFS or SMB as a file sharing protocol.
Okay.
All of the tenant workloads obviously have full network access. They can set that up and have either through the SLB or the site-to-site gateway, they can have access, and then they can access that storage content outside of Azure Stack. So that's available as well to kind of expand.
Would there be a situation where you might deploy an additional scale unit that's very storage heavy with kind of slower, bigger disk if you wanted to do some sort of like archiving or cooler blob storage?
Right, yeah, that may be possible. I'm not sure. I think those are scenarios that are probably a little too early to understand whether customers will find that of value, because I think that there's, it's certainly everything is in place and they can do that. And the blob store that we contain within Azure Stack, I mean, you can do, block blobs and page and tables, et cetera. So it's really, about whether it matches their use cases when they have applications that actually can use that effectively. And so at this point in Azure Stack, I probably would say that's probably not a great use case,
right?
Because we're focused on kind of that application consistency. But it's something that as we go forward, we'll continue, as Daniel said, we'll listen to what customers need and desire, and maybe something that we start to build out. So.
Okay. Now I know that all the networking in Azure Stack on the back end is 10 gig, right?
That's right.
And I know a lot of switches are going 2500 gig. Are there plans to adopt those at the node level, and are you going to see any improvements in performance or anything like that across the storage spaces?
Right. So that it's kind of an interesting discussion because Windows Server is certainly in that place today, right? So it can deploy 10, 25, 40, 100 gig.
Right.
I have a colleague that's been they've actually done quite a few demonstrations of dual 100 gig NICs and an all flash configuration for Spaces Direct, and they're pushing 60 or 80 gigabytes of throughput to the application. So the platform is certainly set up and ready to go and ready to use that. And I think it's really the main decision point really, to be honest, isn't ours, right? It's the choice is going to be between the customer and our hardware partners. So
okay.
I mean, the hardware partners are willing to kind of build and be flexible in what they provide. It's just really kind of getting into the market and understanding what the requirements are for the application set and and how they move forward. My sense is that right now the existing systems that are available for order and that are shipping, as we announced this week, is they're the hybrid storage configuration. So it's a combination of flash and hard disk drive, and that'll cover I think a bulk of the market.
Mm-hmm.
But as we see, I've already started. As we interact with customers, we're starting to understand that there is a desire to have all flash configuration so that there's, kind of a flat latency curve for applications, and the operator doesn't have to think, a lot about, am I going to get into trouble with, as we talked about sizing and performance. So I think that those will start to come, and when we start seeing those, then it'll really start to move into kind of the higher throughput networks. And like I said, Spaces Direct and Windows Server is clearly set up and delivering that today, and so we'll be able to pivot to those as the OEM partners make the decision to bring those to market.
Okay, so basically the software and the OS are ready to handle those advancements in hardware. It's really up to the OEMs to make those advancements available in whatever generation server they currently have out.
That's right, and the network is going to be an interesting progression as we see, kind of the shift to those higher bandwidths, and especially 1025 in the 100 gig systems that'll come to market.
Okay. So what about hardware lifecycle management? So, I mean, this is looking down the line a little bit, but I'm ready to phase out my Gen 1 servers and slot in some Gen 2 servers. I need to remove those workloads off because, I mean, like you said, you can't swap in new hardware in your scale unit, right?
That's right.
So is there going to be a way to migrate those workloads onto a new scale unit so I can retire that old hardware?
Right. So it's an interesting question because it applies not to kind of also just a life cycle from hardware, but also how do I deal with kind of new capabilities as they come to market. And we'll actually follow the exact model that Azure provides today.
Okay.
And what I mean by that is that they really do this all the time, right? So they have old hardware that they've decommissioned and moved forward. And the way they structure this is that through the VM definitions, there's an explicit and implicit placement of those VMs based on the hardware capability. So meaning that if I'm gonna have a VM that has a GPU capability, I'm obviously gonna have to land that on a cluster of hardware that has GPUs within it. The same thing, we'll do the same thing with Azure Stack as we work to add scale units and build out the software structure for it. The placement will be driven by hardware capability in the VMs through the gesture of which VM types are being deployed and what the customer wants when they do that. And so with that model in mind, then you can place, roll in new hardware, expand the system, the VMs will get placed in the right location, and as you decommission workloads, you'll have to be very intentful about eventually being able to say, like, okay, I'm going to move, the VMs that may be active, I'm going to have to effectively redeploy those just like you would in Azure, right?
Right.
So those get moved around in Azure, they give customers heads up and say, okay, we need to move off of this hardware, please redeploy. So it's just a progression like it normally would be in any environment. But we'll eventually get to the point where we provide that. Today it's mainly an architectural statement. It's like, this is the vision. We have a lead in from Azure and how they manage it. We'll use that same gesture. and then we'll just build out the software to support it.
Yeah, I mean, considering the V1 servers haven't even landed in most data centers
right,
yet.
They're
so
going to be there for a very long time, and it's hopefully something we don't have to worry about.
As a former admin, I need to look into the future 3-5 years down the line and figure out how solutions are going to mature. And so that's good to know that there will be a way to do that. We talked about patching a little bit. Are there going to be requirements to be at a certain level of patching in order to get support from Microsoft? Do you have to stay like 1 or 2 patches behind at the most kind of thing?
Yeah, so obviously we're trying to keep consistent with Azure. We think about Azure Stack moving forward on a cloud cadence. For us to be able to adopt features and keep that consistency, we have to have Azure Stacks move forward in the same way. So, so yes, there will be a support requirement around keeping up to date, and we're looking at you can't be more than 3 monthly cycles behind. So if you call up support and you haven't taken the last 3 patches, the first thing they're going to work with you to do is get yourself up to date and then support it. It's really so we can move Azure Stack and that cloud consistency forward. So, yes.
Okay, great. That's kind of what I assumed, but I think people will want to hear confirmation on that. You can't just sit on your hands and not patch.
Yeah, it's not meant to be a system that you deploy in the corner of your data center and just leave it alone. You got to be keeping it forward, like you used the puppy analogy, right? You got to keep feeding this thing, and we feed it with patches, right, and keep it moving forward.
I like that. So I think we've covered a lot of ground. Is there anything you wanted to add or additional sort of the Azure Stack operator role that you want to bring up?
Yeah, I mean, the thing I'll add, aside from plugging my sessions, is you got to think about it a little differently. I mean, it is an integrated system. It is an appliance. The things that you're going to be doing, as much as you'll be using the same familiar tools and the concepts and the terminology are going to be the same, the things that you're going to do on Azure Stack compared to what you do in traditional infrastructure are going to change. And we are hoping to have Azure Stack operators be more involved in that conversation with their developers, right? That managing the service and the SLA becomes critically important, rather than just making sure that some virtualization host is kept up and running. So I would leave them with that. Come in with that different mindset, and then work with us, and we'll kind of educate you and certify you on how best to run Azure Stack and run that Azure cloud in your data center.
Right. Ideally, you don't want to be in that business of patching each individual host and sort of what you're doing in your traditional virtualization deployment now. You kind of want to move away from that and provide more value higher up the stack.
Absolutely.
Right? And so that Azure Stack will get you there. Anything that you wanted to add, Spencer?
No, it's been great to kind of chat about things, and I think we have a ton of sessions this week. We're excited about getting the product into market and getting customers to be successful with it and getting the feedback of how we move forward.
Right.
So it'll be a really exciting week and exciting times ahead. So
awesome. So I will put in the show notes all the sessions. I know as they're recorded, they will become available online for people to view. So as those appear, I'll add them to the show notes so people can go and watch the sessions that interest them the most. If people want to know more about you and what you're up to, do you have a social media presence? Do you hide under a rock? I mean
yeah, so I'm on Twitter, so you can search for Spencer Shepler and you'll find me.
Okay.
It'll pop up. So
got all the DMs blocked.
Yeah, that's right.
What about you, Daniel?
Yeah, I'm on Twitter as well. It's at @dsavage @ATMS. You can follow me on there. Yeah.
Okay, awesome. Great. Thank you so much, Daniel and Spencer, for joining me on the AnexiPod today. If you enjoy the AnexiPod and looking for more content, why not check out our sister podcast, Buffer Overflow. On the show, I'm joined weekly by my co-host, Chris Hayner, and an assortment of other colleagues at Anexinet to discuss what's new and interesting in the IT news sphere. Thank you to the marketing team from Anexinet for helping me pull all this together, and the team here at Ignite for helping out. Thanks to Lee Rosevere and Professor Click. They provide the music for AnexiPod. Thank you to Anexinet for flying me out here. Well, I guess actually Microsoft flew me out here, so thank you to them. If you're looking for a company to help you with your digital transformation, then I would recommend Anexinet. You can contact them and see how they can help. If you'd like to know more about me, I'm on Twitter at Ned1313, so pretty easy to remember. Or on my website, nedinthecloud.com. Very clever, I know. And thanks for tuning in. And remember, IT moves pretty fast. If you don't stop to look around once in a while, you could miss it. All right. Thank you, everybody.